affiliate of the Regional Heritage Centre at Lancaster University. He's published a lot about the history of Cumbria and the Lake District, and including with two eminent members of the Regional Heritage Centre, Angus Winchester and Robert Dunning, a book on Henry Hobhouse's tour through Cumbria in 1774. And he's brought some of these epic books with us, with him tonight, which no doubt he'll say more about later. He writes a regular column for Cumbria Life, and he lent us one of his master students, Rose Appleton, to do some research on Wordsworth's link with Ullswater, and she provided material for our Ullswater Heritage Knowledge Bank based on that research. Chris has told me he's got something like 750 reference books, sources on this area over the last 300 years, guides, maps, and so on. So it's a bit of a tall order to summarize all this work in 45 minutes. But he'll talk for that length of time. There'll be a Q&A after that. And then he'll look at perceptions and descriptions of Ullswater and the Lake District over the last 300 years, how it's changed, to say a little bit about the origin of the word, or the phrase, or what you call it, Lake District. Why are we the Lake District? And so, without further ado, I would like very much to pass the floor to him. He lives in Carlisle. I'd like to thank you very much for coming here tonight, and I'm sure we're all in for a treat. Thank you, Chris.
No, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was very glad that Rose, one of our MA students, decided to come and take the very kind placement that she sponsored. And it's really nice to be able to keep these connections going. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm guessing I'm being heard and seen all right, both by people who are in the room as well as people who aren't. But if something happens along the way, people tuning in, or I go awry here in the room, please let me know about it. Anyhow, I wanted to begin us with a question, which is a question that relates to this map here. There's 6 black dots marked on the map, which I hope you can see. What do they mark, and what do they have in common? 6 spots marked with black dots. What do they mark, and what do they have in common? Any answers? Any guesses?
All Ullswaters.
National Parks, it's a good guess. Definitely a good guess. I heard another murmur too. There's Lake District. Lake District's still part of it, definitely. Definitely. Sorry if I can't hear you clearly enough. My hearing does go in and out a little bit, but these are some good guesses. It actually turns out that this is the kind of double question you can answer with just one word, and that word is Ullswater. Because this map shows us where Ullswater. I know. You could have said it, and it might have stolen my thunder, so to speak. But it shows where Ullswater is, or at least where Ullswaters are, because it turns out that Ullswater is located in 6 different places around the world. Now, our Ullswater, or your Ullswater, the Ullswater that's just over the way from here, it's the first Ullswater, it's the original Ullswater, it's the namesake of these other Ullswater, but it's not the only Ullswater. The name, turns out, has traveled around the world and given its graces to small towns in Ontario, Canada, as well as in down in Australia, all the way down south. It's also graced the site of what was once a tea plantation in Sri Lanka. And all that, I guess, goes to show that when it comes to geography, we really can't take things for granted. Context matters a great deal. Things are not always where or what we might anticipate them to be. In a way, I think this also shows us how names affect the way that we look at the world, experience the world. The tea plantation in the tropics might seem a fairly far cry from our Ullswater here in the Ullswater Valley, but the fact that the 2 places share the same name links them together. Connection may be merely nominal, mere the sake of a shared name, but nonetheless, it affects the way that we think about these places as being linked together by a shared name. And I think that tells us something about names and the names that we give places, the way that they can affect the way that we see the world, the way that we draw connections between different parts of the world. And in terms of words that gets used to describe places linked together, I've always been really interested in this term Lake District, which gets used to describe the area that we happen to be in this evening, or at least many of us in this room happen to be in. I think it's an interesting word to study the history of, because actually, as a form, the Lake District is a little bit difficult to pin down. You can look up the dimensions of the Lake District National Park, a World Heritage Site, now World Heritage Site. You can look up those dimensions, but if you do, you'll discover that they've actually changed over the course of time. The Lake District isn't in the same place it used to be, nor is it the same size that it used to be. So we look at it here, we see the Lake District. If you look at it today and look at its boundaries, you'll discover that it covers approximately 912 square miles, covering nearly a third of the county of Cumbria. But if you looked up the facts back in 1951 when the national park was formed, well, you would have found some different things. First of all, Cumbria, of course, didn't exist back in 1951. Then the Lake District was this portion of the sections of the historic counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, the historic 100 of Lonsdale north of the Sands. That's the first part of it. But the second part, actually, the Lake District was smaller in 1951 than it is today, technically smaller. The designation or the estimates of the park's original area vary. The designation order that was drawn up by the National Parks Commission back in 1951 gives the area measurement for the Lake District as approximately 866 square miles. Those of you in the room might be able to see that here. So approximately 866 square miles. And that's a figure you'll see reported on other official documents, but it happens to be wrong. The actual original area of the Lake District National Park was somewhat closer to 885 square miles. And the reason for that error is just a kind of an inaccuracy in the historical reading of the park's boundary. It wasn't until the maps were digitized in the 2000s, the Lake District National Park Authority went about and corrected the measurement of the original area of the park. Of course, though, the park has grown over the last few years. Certainly, if you can see here between 1951, the eastern and southeastern boundary, you can see how that's now a much larger boundary thanks to an extension that was made, I guess, back in 2016, not so very long ago, just extending the national park's boundary farther to the east, farther to the southeast. So I think this is noteworthy. I guess it shows us that national parks aren't always necessarily stable places. Their boundaries might be fixed in law, but pinning them down on the earth can actually be a slightly harder task. But I think it also shows something really interesting about the way that we think of the Lake District, or the way we might see the Lake District represented. And that's to say that the extent of the region, I think, in these kinds of estimations and the way that most people think about the Lake District, the extent of the region ends up being defined by its mountains. The conservationists and the civil servants who first really wrote the blueprint for the Lake District National Park in 1951, they definitely had that point of reference, thinking about the extent of the region as really coextensive with the spread of that central mountain dome. So there, as you can see, you're taking the mountain dome into consideration the way that the national park's boundaries were originally laid out back in 1951. And I've always been a charm to think about it. Cumbria, we have this somewhat elliptical mountain dome. The geologist J.E. Marr, this is John Edward Marr, back in 1916 in his book, The Geology of the Lake District. I can pass some of these around. This one's a nice one. He described the shape of the massif in relation to its drainage as caddy spoon shape. So it's like a caddy spoon with its handle pointed towards the east. So I can't pass this through the camera. It's going to come around that way. So a caddy spoon with its handle facing east to give a sense of the shape of the Lake District's central massif. Now, of course, that analogy isn't as well known as the one that Wordsworth proposed some years earlier, back in 1810. He described the shape of the Lake District's main valleys. I'm sure you may be familiar with this quotation, describing those valleys as spokes radiating from the nave of the wheel, diverging from the nave of the wheel is his quotation. I think both those similes, both the caddy spoon, which you can see up here, as well as Wordsworth's wheel, they They both, I think, give us an indicative sense of how the landscape is orientated. What's really interesting about that is actually one of Wordsworth's contemporaries, a guy named John Rooke, and another geologist who's one of Mars' contemporaries named Hugh Robert Mill. He's the one who drew up this other map I have on the side here. Shows these radiating circles. They followed that line of thinking about the sense of the central mountain dome, and they both proposed in different contexts an idea which ended up being really relevant for the shaping of the Lake District in the 20th century. And that's that high rays, or sometimes called high white stones up in the Langdales, this relatively low-lying fell, relatively high, but relatively low-lying fell, marks the spot where the center of the Lake District's mountain point, this idea of the Cumbrian Massif, where the center of that point would have sat historically, and everything else has eroded since then, which has given the kind of roughly radial symmetry and drainage around the region that people like Mill were trying to map out at the turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century. And you can see here Mill surmising that, and I apologize, the text is a little small, but Mill surmising that if you took a circle of 15 miles radius from high white stones here in the center of the map, then within 15 miles you'd cover pretty much every lake and tarn in the Lake District and almost all the land of greater altitude than 1,000 feet. And early members of the Friends of the Lake District and other conservationists really latched onto that idea in the campaign to create the Lake District.
I've got the print again, yeah.
If you drew a line of 15 miles of high white stones or high rays, you'd effectively have pretty much the entire Lake District in the circumference. Even more importantly, though, I think that the perceived centrality of high rays went on to inform the plans that John Dower put together. Really, in many ways, the architect not only of the Lake District National Park, but of national parks of England and Wales in general. So physical geography, in this case, provides a rational basis for thinking about the Lake District in this way, as an area that is unified around this mountain dome, but also distinctive from, set apart from the area that's surrounding it. What's interesting, though, I think, is that the Lake District clearly hasn't always been seen in that way, as a place set apart from the area that lies around it. I'm reminded here of something that Bruce Logan Thompson wrote. Getting onto that side a little early, that's okay. I didn't bring Logan Thompson's book. Sorry about that. I meant to bring a copy of his book. A really interesting book, The Lake District and the National Trust. If you ever see a copy, published in 1946, and partly interesting because Thompson was the National Trust's first land agent in the region, and he published his book just after the war in 1946. And he makes the point at the beginning of the book that's always really stuck with me, which is that whereas the oldest rocks in the Lake District are more than 500 million years old, the Lake District itself, certainly as we think of it, is only about 250 years old. Until the second half of the 18th century, as you can read, nobody thought of the lakes as forming a district. It's only since tourists began coming here that the Lake District has been conceived of as such, as a district, as an entity set unto itself. So farming and mining might have made the Cumbrian landscape, but tourism made the Lake District. I like that idea, and there's a good deal of merit in that argument. It's clearly borne out by the earliest maps of the region. One of my favorites here being the Roth map, a map from really, I guess, the turn of the 15th century, sometimes dated to the later 14th century, sometimes early 15th century, turn of the 15th century. And it's a plan really of the entire British Isles, as you can see, laid out slightly differently than we might expect about to be these days. We're used to this north being the cardinal point of orientation. Here, in terms of medieval cartography, we have east as the dominant cardinal point, heading upwards, so east towards Jerusalem, east towards the Holy Land. And so we end up looking at the section that's Cumbria, here taken out from that square, slightly different orientations, like Staines up here at the top and Workington's down here towards the bottom, right? So north is that direction, east towards the top, west towards the bottom. I think that's really interesting because if you look at the map in closer detail, and I definitely would recommend, if you have a chance to do so, to Google the Gulf map, to look at some of the high resolution images of the map that Bodleian libraries have published online, it's worth having a play around, at least in the Cumbrian section, because as you'll see here, there's quite a lot of detail along the west coast. This is actually supposed to be Furness Abbey down here, down the Furness Peninsula, and you can make that out because it's got a church spire, so it's Furness Abbey. Equally along the way here, you have things like Egremont Castle, which is a castellated little turret around it. And then up here, I guess one of the bigger places marked on the map, Carlisle, with its cathedral, of course. So you can see a church spire, but if you look closely, you also see a castellated turret with a tower, the castle. Equally, the city walls are present there. It's actually quite a lot of detail in this map from the turn of the 15th century, around the coast and then down the Eden Valley, going south from Carlisle. In the middle, though, we now, I guess, think of as the Lake District, you don't see very much at all. If you look very closely, you'll see a round pool that's labeled Windermere, suitably enough. Then you also see a wiggly line, along the side which someone seems to have written Montes Fernensi, the Furness Fells, as we would call them. But otherwise, the inner reaches of Cumbria are a blank in the Goth map. There's very little of specific detail included there. Here, it's the inhabited places that surround the mountains that matter the most, or at least what map makers have decided to dedicate attention and detail to. The fells, the mountains are of secondary interest. That way of looking at the lakes, it persisted for quite a long time. It's evident in the political and ecclesiastical geographies that influenced the region's shaping and its management from the Middle Ages through into early modernity. It is also apparent in accounts like the one that this man, Lieutenant Hammond, we don't know what his first name was, but he was an army officer from Norwich who came on a tour of the north back in 1634. He passed this away, staying different locations under the roof of William Howard and enjoying William Howard's hospitality. There's a part in his account where they go to Greystoke Castle, not so very far from where we are tonight, in which Hammond is describing the scenery that he sees around him, describing the stately castle of Greystoke being situated on an ascent, but a little into a large walled park, replenished with a great store of deer. In it, there are hills that command another park, like a solitary wilderness, and is nothing but hideous hanging hills and great pools. So we have the sense, certainly in early modernity, that those people who are paying attention to the fells aren't finding a great deal to enjoy and looking at. And one, of course, finds very similar sentiments expressed by people like Daniel Defoe, a century later. It's sort of always amusing, perhaps too often quoted line from Defoe's tour, The Whole Isle of Great Britain, where he describes the landscape north of Kendal up into Westmoreland into Cumberland as being eminent for being the wildest, most barren and frightful of any that I've passed over in England, or even Wales. That's always fun, isn't it? Now, such claims, I think, should, of course, be set alongside some of the less sensationalist accounts that have come down to us from the 17th century, 18th century. The accounts of travelers like Celia Fiennes, but equally the accounts of local antiquaries, people like Thomas Denton, Warnell, and Thomas Machell, or Kirby Thor. But even those writers that did treat the uplands in their accounts usually tend to treat them in a more peripheral fashion than they would treat the settled and cultivated landscapes surrounding the mountains. I think Fiennes is really indicative in this particular sense, because although her account, I think, famously and wonderfully includes the description of the descent from Ambleside to Patterdale, so it's going over Kirkstone Pass, one of the very first detailed accounts we really have of a journey over one of the passes, I think is really noteworthy, but it's also noteworthy that she ends up spending more time describing Lowther Hall. Again, the interest here is mainly with settled places, with estates and the developed countryside, than it is with the uplands or the mountains per se. It's really only when tourists began to enter the region in search of the picturesque in the later 1700s that the idea of the Lake District as a district really began to take shape. And I think one way of seeing that is actually just to turn to the titles of some of the books that we have, really from the later 18th century onwards, one of which I'll send around. I said to Tim and Ann, I'd have some show and tell. This is not the edition of the book I'll talk about, but it's a later edition of a book most people would know as Thomas West's Guide to the Lakes. It's also this one as well. That's a later edition of it, slightly water damaged. So this book, Thomas West, often discussed as a relatively seminal work in histories of Lake District guidebooks. It's thought to be, and I think widely considered to be, the first guide to the Lake District, certainly the first guide to call it such. And the title of the book is really interesting because as published in 1778, and as you can make out on the slide, I do hope, the book was called not A Guide to the Lake District, but rather A Guide to the Lakes, dedicated to the lovers of landscape studies and all who have visited or intend to visit the lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. That's a rather lengthy title, though, so in referring to it, I'm just going to call it A Guide to the Lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. Now, I think the difference between those two titles is really telling. So A Guide to the Lake District implies that Cumbria's lakes and fells form a kind of region unto themselves. They are a district unto themselves. In much the same way that someone like William Watson imagined them in his poem Lakeland Once More from 1894. And I quote, "Region separate, sacred, of mere and of gill and of mountain." It's not a particularly good poem, but it's one that's well worth quoting. And I think it reflects a view of the lakes that isn't so unrecognizable to us today. Again, this is 1894, Watson writing. A view of the lakes that in his day was very much the same view that we share today. Lakeland here, as a sort of Lakeland Once More, Lakeland as this region, separate, sacred, geographically distinctive unto itself, divided from the world around it. Now, such a view is rather different than the view I think that's conjured up when you look at a book like West's, as described as A Guide to the Lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. Not district, but Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. The title doesn't imply the lakes form a separate region so much as it registers a historical fact, in that the lakes were once in the historic counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, in much the same way that it's now, at least for the time being, only in one county. They keep changing. Now, I appreciate that this is a distinction that might sound somewhat superficial between Lake District on the one hand, lakes in the counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. Might sound somewhat superficial. When you think about the names in terms of their differences, you might think this is a mere matter of nomenclature. But I think the issue goes deeper than that, because the words we use, place names included, but certainly all the words we use, they shape and it reflect our experience of the world and our sense of the world. I think that is especially true of place names, for reasons I was touching on a little bit earlier, in reference to those 6 Ullswaters we saw. Place names ultimately promote specific kinds of perspectives. So I mean, the decision to call a tea plantation in Sri Lanka Ullswater is a very particular kind of decision. It gives that place very particular association. So referring to one place by a given name instead of another name is of course just a matter of preference, but preferences about what places ought to be called are also in some way usually preferences about what places ought to be, what we wish them to be. And Edmund Hodge, I think, made much the same point in his book. Should have brought a copy of this one along, sorry I didn't. A really nice book from 1957 though, Enjoying the Lakes by Edmund Hodge. If you can find a copy, I do recommend this one. So he made that point about how the choice of names influences the way that people experience and perceive the world. And he did so in order to criticize what he saw as the artificiality of, that was inherent in the Lake District's designation as a national park. In his book, he takes a slightly resistant view to the creation of a national park, and he's writing in the 1950s. So he also takes issue with this line from Watson's poem that I've quoted, "Region separate, sacred, of mere and of gill and of mountain." Hodge thought that this view of the lakes as a region separate and sacred, as a place distinct from the area around it, bore little resemblance to the views of the people who actually lived in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, and he put the point plainly and with a touch of contempt. Those who are more interested in and familiar with the history of the counties than the hill-rambling tourist are less confident of the entity and homogeneity of this mystical realm of Lakeland he's referring to. Now, Hodge wasn't alone in that regard. One can think of other writers from the 1940s or 1950s who weighed in with similar kinds of concerns about the complications and implications of the creation of the national park, and were advocating a slightly more holistic view of I guess what we now think of as Cumbria as being integrally part of the same larger whole. Writers like Norman Nicholson from that period in the 1940s, who books like Greater Lakeland and other really great spoke about the region, making the argument that we shouldn't think of the Lake District as divided from the rest of then the counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. For us today, Cumbria, we should see it as part of this integrated whole. But another person who makes that argument in the 1940s is Bruce Logan Thompson, who we encountered a little bit earlier, the National Trust's first land agent in the Lake District. Now, Thompson, for all his commitment to the work of the National Trust, also acknowledged that the idea of the Lake District as a region was somewhat arbitrary, and had an intimation of that earlier. But I like what he writes here, just into his book on the second page. If you live near one of the Cumberland lakes, you consider yourself a Cumbrian rather than a Lakelander, possibly because it's a pleasanter name, but certainly because, day by day, your doings are concerned not so much with the Lake District as with the nearest market town. The shops are up there, not on the top of Scafell. Now, there's a lot of common sense. I think in those words, there's a great deal of historical validity in those words as well. I think of a number of important social and economic historians of, let's call it Cumbria for the sake of simplicity, people like John Marshall, among others, John Walton as well, who articulated the importance of local market towns for communities spread throughout the valleys and hills of the Lake District. Market towns being important, as it were, center of gravity within their social existence, how towns in the valleys really formed the habitual territories in which people operated, really from the early modern period onwards, and how that gave them a sense of connection with communities at lower lying elevation, the sense of market towns as bringing the region together. So I think Thompson's view here is historically salient, both relevant to his time, relevant to other times as well. And as I mentioned, this is a book that was published in 1975, so back in, sorry, much, I mentioned it was a book published about 75 years ago, beg your pardon, back in 1946. Just a year after the publication, interestingly, of John Dower's report, that influential report that really paved the way for the creation, not just of the Lake District, but of really of the national parks movement in England and Wales. I think it's worth bearing that period in mind because it helps us appreciate the political significance of the distinction that Thompson is drawing here. Cumbrian on the one hand, Lakelander on the other. This might seem, again, like a mere difference of names, a superficial distinction between different kinds of nomenclature. But each of these names implies a different point of view, a different sense of identity. And I expect actually a fair few of Thompson's contemporaries would have rejected both Cumbrian and Lakelander as names, usually probably in favor of their, I don't know, local town or village, the valley in which they happen to live. People do like to be partisan. Not always sure which way Ullswater people split. I guess it just depends on which side of the lake you're from, whether you're Westmoreland or Cumberland. But people like to be partisan, and the National Parks Commission discovered that to its peril back in the 1950s when it set about trying to staff, to plan and to staff the newly created Lake District National Park back in 1951. Now, there are folders of letters and clippings of the National Archives and Kew that attest to this, and attest to how firmly and resistant all three county councils were about ceding ground to any kind of central authority in the Lake District. They make for really interesting reading, especially in light of our current predicaments. But one of the gems in that folder, I think, is this letter that Robert Adcock, who was the clerk of Lancashire County Council, the letter that he writes to this man, Harold Abrams, who is the secretary of the National Parks Commission in 1951. And I quote, "So far as Lancashire is concerned," so he's writing here about the efforts on the part of the National Parks Commission to have an independently staffed joint planning board for the Lake District National Park as created in the 50s. So as far as Lancashire is concerned, writes Adcock, we've never liked the idea of a joint board. But on the other hand, in view of the attitude of the minister, he's actually referring here to Macmillan, who is then Minister of Housing and Local Government. So in view of the minister, we do feel that no useful purpose would be served by objecting to a board and have accepted the fact that a board is inevitable. However, we have here what we think is a very efficient planning department with all the requisite experts. That being so, we are very much opposed to the idea of the new board having its own staff. It seems painfully familiar, doesn't it? And in a roundabout way, I think this takes us back to Thomas West, though. Everything is connected. Because it's evident, I think, that Adcock and his fellow councillors back in the 50s were much more comfortable with the idea of the lakes in Cumberland, Westmorland, and Lancashire in particular here, than their idea with the idea of the Lake District. So Lake counties, perhaps, more than Lake District. Certainly, Lake counties more than Lake District as a sense of lakeland, separate, sacred unto itself. Edmund Hodge evidently agreed. He weighed in the same period. This is actually from a clipping down at University of Reading, I think. Regardless, though, he writes into the Manchester Guardian in 1953, advising, because they were carrying up the plan and advising that the real solution to planning in the national park, this newly created national park, was to recognize the historical and natural differences which, for those who have eyes to see, exist between, say, Coniston and Ennerdale, and to break up this impossible area into three. So another solution, just send it back the way it was. Now, if anything, I think that combing over these sorts of old debates invites us to think carefully about the names that have been used through time to describe the area that we now would think of, or tend to think of, most of us, as the Lake District. In West's guidebook affirms that the lakes were not always thought of as a district, lakes in the counties, for example. And the disputes of the creation of the national parks, the National Park, Lake District National Park, occasioned in 1951, alongside those older names that we find in people like West, I think it reminds us that the region was defined by other kinds of geographical and administrative priorities long before the idea of Lakeland, a la Watson, separate and sacred, ever was formed. But why was it that the names used to describe the Lake District began to change? When was the idea of the Lake District first thought of? When was that term first used? When did it become common, or relatively commonplace, to refer to the Lake District as the Lake District instead of referring to it as lakes in Cumberland, Westmorland, and Lancashire? And what about that term Lakeland that we saw in Watts's poem in 1894? When was that term first used? And what about English Lake District? One of those interesting things about the Lake District, it's really one of the only national parks I can think of in England, at any rate, that is branded as English in that way. We wouldn't really ever talk about the English Dales. If you're going on holiday, you said you're going off to the English Broads, you probably get confused looks. Now, the questions I'm posing here are certainly too large. They're simple questions in a way, but kind of devilish to answer when you stop and try to think about how to determine when the idea of the Lake District was first formed. I suppose a hyper-empiricist with an endless library would set about reading and be able to come back to us in due course of time to discover the first instance in which the term Lake District was used, or when ideas like Lakeland first emerged in print. But for us mere mortals, I think we should follow the examples of scholars like Franco Moretti, and let bibliography, or at least title indexes, be our guide. Now, Franco Moretti is a scholar at Stanford University in the States. I think he's relatively well known as a literary historian, cultural historian, because of his application of quantitative methods and approaches, usually borrowed from the domain of the social sciences or the applied sciences, to the study of literary history, cultural history. He's associated with this idea of distant reading, that you can learn a lot about trends in literary history and cultural history by looking at a distance, big changes in the kinds of titles that are used over the course of time, the kinds of fiction that's being published, the rise and fall of genres. So looking at things at a distance instead of actually engaging closely in interpretation with books, literary works of art. This idea of distance reading is very strongly associated with his work. And one of his more ingenious distance reading experiments involves looking at changes across 7,000 different titles published in English. Thinking about 7,000 different English novels. Not compiling, as Tim was mentioning, I've been compiling over the last few years through the lockdown, the kind of bibliography of books about the English Lake District, and thus far I haven't got to 7,000 titles. I've managed to compile nearly 800 to date, 767 to be precise, books published about the Lake District from 1751 to 1951. So in the 200-year run up to the creation of the national park in 1951, I've been able to find 767 books published about the Lake District. That doesn't include revised editions, new editions of the work, second printings, etc. Just one count for each individual work. It doesn't include works that might have appeared in newspapers or in magazines, just as printed books. It's getting quiet here, so I'll pass another one around. This one has some nice illustrations. Sylvan's picturesque handbook, or pictorial handbook, perhaps. So of these 767, again, individual books, not reprints, not new editions, nothing from newspapers or magazines. But I think that's enough to begin to observe some interesting changes over the course of time and the names that people use to describe the region, how the region appears. So allow me to start by going back once more to the title of West's Guide, which we see here. A Guide to the Lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. Now that phrase, lakes in Lancashire, Cumberland, Westmoreland, or some variation thereof, sometimes just lakes in Cumberland and Westmoreland. That appears in the title of no fewer than 23, beg your pardon, 23 books published between 1778, when the West Guide first appears, and 1838. And if you include variations, like lakes in Cumberland on its own, or lakes in Westmoreland on its own, then the number of titles increases from 23 to 49, and the date range increases a little bit as well, from 1767 all the way to 1867. So more titles, longer range of dates. And you can see that if you look here at this chart. So at the top line of the chart, the dotted line just shows you the number of titles by decade grouping. You can see here down at the bottom, here we have our decade groupings. That dotted line shows the total number of titles, as it were, by decade. Now, this dashed line here, this shows the number of titles that contain some variation of lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. What's interesting there is you can see it follows in the early period. The dashed line more or less follows the rising number of titles in the dotted line, really until about certainly until the turn of the 19th century, when that number of titles that use lakes in the counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, Lancashire drops off, and it really drops off altogether after the 1840s, just flattens out. And we've got very few titles that use that phrase, lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, certainly from the 1840s onwards. Now, the list of titles that I've compiled to date isn't comprehensive. It's more indicative than it is total. It is likely that there are many books I haven't found yet, or that should be included that I haven't done. So I think nonetheless, the data that I've compiled gives us enough to work with to draw some provisional conclusions, or at least to look at some provisional trends and patterns and then draw conclusions from those. Because it does seem, though, from what I've looked into, the number of titles that use that term, phrase, lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, does drop off pretty steeply from the 1840s. Few new books appear with that phrase in their title or some variant of after the 1840s. The titles of lots of books from the 1840s onwards, of course, still reference Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. At least 4 books published during the first half of the 20th century use, I guess, phrases like lake counties as well, including one of these is a nice one. This is a later edition of the Lake Counties by W.G. Collingwood. So Lake Counties does appear. So that appears in the early 20th century. In 4 instances, we have Lake Counties. But by then, certainly by the time a book like Collingwood's is appearing in the 20th century, other names had really come into more common use. Take lakes, for instance. A few of you were looking at, yes, we have Sylvan's pictorial handbook to the lakes. We have lakes. Was used on its own Well, it's sometimes listed as having been used on its own in bibliographies like this one, as early as 1783. So Bicknell, who inventories several dozen works published about the Lake District between the 1750s and the 1850s. He draws attention to this collection called 7 Maps of the Lake, which are these maps by Peter Crosthwaite of Crosthwaite's Museum in Keswick. And some of you may have seen the splendid map of Ullswater that he has as part of his collection of 7 maps. That is listed as 7 Maps of the Lakes in 1783. However, looking into it, and I'm reassured here by Diana Patterson's work, that Crosthwaite's maps don't seem to ever have been sold as a collection that way, as a collection of 7. You could buy them independently, but it's not at all clear that they actually ever were bound together as a single set and sold under the title 7 Maps of the Lake, certainly not in the 1780s. That title was used, I think, in 1969 for a facsimile edition of Crosthwaite's maps when they were produced. But the name, the use of the term lakes itself in titles doesn't really begin to become prominent really until after the 1840s, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because we saw previously this dashed line at the bottom. This is the falling number of titles that use phrases like lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, etc. Here we see with the line comprised of a gray dash with 2 dots, a line comprising a gray dash with 2 dots. We can see how the number of titles that use lakes increases really by the 1840s, then falls off a little bit, brief rise again in the early 20th century, and then by the mid 20th century. Really, beginning of the 1840s, a more pronounced increase in the number of books that use lakes in their titles. Now, a few books do, as I said, use lakes a little later on. Think of Hardwick Drummond Rawnsley's books, his Monts the Lakes, for example, of 1906. But the use of lakes, I guess, as you can see, was not as prevalent by the early 20th century as it seems to have been in about the 1840s or so. And by that point, the phrase Lake District, or occasionally Lake Country, had also entered the mix. So another line, stacking up lines here, but the black line composed of short dashes, shows us the number of titles that use phrases like Lake District or Lake Country. So I want you to focus on the black line here, the black line of dashes. That line shows the number of books with titles that contain the phrase Lake District, Lake Country. And again, notice how the number of books increases from the 1840s to the 1860s, and then from the 1880s to the turn of the 20th century. Long after the number of titles using the phrase lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, or some variation thereof, really flatlines and disappears. And I appreciate that I'm presenting several different charts here, but there are just 2 more to go, the penultimate one being chart 4 here, where I hope you'll be able to see one more line, the line of longer gray dashes. That line shows the number of books with titles that contain the phrase English Lake District or English Lake, so bringing in that labeling of the landscape as national, being English or belonging to England, which really, as you can see, picks up from the mid-20th, so the mid-19th century, particularly between the 1850s and 1870s. And after then, the number of books that use English Lakes or English Lake District in their titles gradually declines. So it tapers off, certainly by the turn of the 20th century, reducing to the mid-20th century. By that time, though, most new books are actually using a different term altogether, and that's our final chart here. You want to please be here, but that's Lakeland, which is this line formed of a long black dash with a single black dot. As you can see, that rises really from the later 19th century, but comes on a storm in the early to mid 20th century, where the number of titles actually more or less follows the same slope of the total number of titles. So the term Lakeland being used with increasing prevalence, certainly across the early 20th century. Now, there's a lot of detail here. I appreciate there's a lot to digest. I think there are some general conclusions that can be drawn from this data, even though it's a bit provisional and a bit messy. And some of the conclusions might seem relatively obvious, some of which I think some do reinforce some of the established narrative that we have about the history of the Lake District. The fact that the number of books that use the phrase, or used phrases like lakes in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire falls off after the 1840s might easily seem to be something that would correlate with the completion of railway networks linking the Lake District, not only with the rest of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, but also with the rest of the nation and the wider world. Certainly the completion of the Kendal Windermere Railway in 1847 is seen as this important moment of junction of communication lines linking up. Now that railway has, for good reasons, long been associated with the emergence of mass tourism in the Lake District, or the emergence of something like mass tourism in the Lake District from the Victorian period. And I think the processes by which the area that we now know as Cumbria became, and John Marshall, again the social historian, Lancaster historian John Marshall, describes how, and really as a consequence of new technology, communication in the Victorian era, the Lake District does become a place that's not only more completely integrated into the nation, but also much more self-conscious of itself as being a part of the nation, being the counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. And that's something that Paul Redmond's gone into, I think, in really fascinating ways in his recent book, Storied Ground, published back in 2018, examining the emergence of this idea of the Lake District as a national property, the sense of it being all of Wordsworth and a sort of a national property. And so in this period where the Lake District is becoming a better connected, more self-conscious part of the nation, it's also attaining that privilege of being English Lake District, the English Lake Country in some instances. So I guess so far that's relatively predictable. What do you make, though, of the rapid rise of Lakeland, which I think is the really surprising outcome of this analysis? The rapid rise of Lakeland, especially from the fin de siècle, from the 1890s onwards, I think that's a more surprising trend overall. It doesn't undermine the kind of narrative that people like Redmond, who I was just mentioning, what he spelled out in terms of the emergence of the Lake District as a national property, eventually as a national park by the mid-20th century. It doesn't undermine what he has to say. I think Lakeland is, in a funny way, a kind of counterpart of England, land of lakes, land of the Angles. But I think it's also noteworthy how much more prevalent the term Lakeland has become in either English Lake District, English Lake Country, or any others by the early to mid 20th century, certainly in the decades immediately preceding the creation of the national park. And a couple of different explanations, I think, suggest themselves and try to explain the rise of Lakeland in that period. And they, I guess, all really revolve around the perception of the lakes, to quote Watson, poet Watson once more, as a region separate and sacred. In some cases, that's a separateness that's connected with claims about the unique social history of the Cumberland Fells. So think of Victorian fascination about the supposed Scandinavian heritage of the peoples of Cumbria, if we think of it today. I think there's a sense of the region as having a kind of separateness, which might inform its sense as Lakeland, this region separate and sacred. But equally, in other instances, we have that sense of separateness or sacredness or distinctiveness that's implied in the term Lakeland, associated with the perception of the Lake District as a comparatively, well, at least as a part of England that was comparatively untouched or less touched by the forces of industrial modernity. And there's a book like Cheng Yi's wonderful The Silent Traveler, a Chinese artist in Lakeland. Well worth the view if you've not ever seen a copy, but even if you have, they're always nice to see. So Lakeland either is separate in relation to its particular social history, demographic history, or separate as a place that seems special and distinctive from the rest of England, in this case, to Cheng Yi as the Silent Traveler. Now, in either case, though, I think it's clear that the increased prevalence of Lakeland between the late 1800s and the mid-20th century was connected with an increased appetite and audience for some of the publications like the kind we've been passing around so far over the last hour. And I think it's worth noting, if you can stomach just one last slide, one last chart, I should add, chart number 6. What you'll be able to see here is actually the number of titles by 50-year grouping. And you can see that the number of titles increases year upon year. So we are seeing an increased, if not appetite, at least audience for books about the region over this time. Now, we should, of course, also be very wary of reading too much in the titles of books. There is, of course, that old expression about judging a book by its cover. Yet surveying the titles of books, I think, does afford some interesting insights into how public perceptions of the Lake District changed over the 200 years leading up to the designation of the Lake District National Park in the mid-20th century. I think it helps to bear out the idea that it was tourism, and I guess more especially the printing of books for tourists, that helped make the Lake District what we think of it as today, whereas the Lake District was once historically a part of these three historic counties of Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire. By the start of the 20th century, certainly on the Lakeland, we see it beginning to become what it's described as being in that poem by Watson, separate, sacred, and distinct unto itself. I'll leave things there, not my time, but thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, but I hope you've enjoyed that.
Gosh, thank you very much indeed.
May I sit or shall I stand for the camera?
Maybe we should change it.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just trying to imagine a place where all these 767 publications would be located. Where would you put them? I mean,
Well,
are they in your house at the moment?
Actually, I meant to, there's a thank you here. I should thank a few different, I mean, where they are in different places. Many of them are in the British Library. A lot of the titles I tracked down just using either the short title catalog or actually just the catalog of the British Library itself, or indeed they're just over the way in Dacre at the collection of the wonderful Tim Sykes, who has a fantastic collection of historical publications about Cumbria, the Lake District. There's some of his books, some British Library books, and then these bibliographies, including Peter Bicknell's, and pass this one around too if you're interested. It's a really useful book if you're interested in the history of the county. It's not comprehensive. It was drawn up in the 1990s before the aid of a lot of the digitized resources to which researchers could now avail themselves, of which they could avail themselves. But actually a very useful sense of kind of where you can get information about these books historically. So they're not all in my house, sadly. Many of them are just up in Dacre, many more either at Bath Spa or down in London.
Can I open up to questions?
It's interesting, these two books, which must be about the latest published, do you know what they refer to as this area? Then?
For our Zoomers, he's
Lakeland.
David Brown's referring to the two guides that have been
It's
produced.
started by Lakeland, and Ullswater Way is Lakeland's newest long distance trail.
I would never use
I wouldn't have, no, I wouldn't have
I
done
would never say that. If I've named it. I mean, I refer to it as lakes.
it. Lakeland means going to a large warehouse shop. Lakeland plastics.
But then, when I go through, what do you call it? The lake?
I was always told it the lakes.
Yeah. I don't think I've never used that word. Apart from you.
I'm in Somerset.
I think in the past it was Lakeland. And I think a lot of overseas visitors refer to it as Lakeland.
That's what I remember actually. It's song that probably didn't.
We're talking in the hall for our Zoomers about
I think
Lakeland.
you have to come further.
Yeah.
The one thing that struck me when you showed all your charts, 1840, when we started to see the introduction of the English Lake term, that also coincides with an awful lot of rich men, young men, doing the Grand Tour. They would go to the Italian lakes. Did that influence the English lakes term to differentiate between the two? I don't know.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the very first titles in which English Lakes appears is in 1804, and it's to differentiate the tour of the English Lakes from a tour up to Scotland to see the rocks. But precisely that sense of the awareness of other national landscapes, and the fact that they are celebrated as distinctive to that nation, its people, its character, its landscape. If people are seizing on the Lake District, certainly by the 1850s, then the number of those titles increases. Is losing which track is which. That line, I guess. Interestingly, certainly, no, there we go. That's where it becomes a little bit confusing. That's English links, isn't it? English district. Certainly by the mid-19th century, there are many more collections of whether they're engravings, whether they're lithographs, picture books, effectively, plenty books of photography that are showcasing different splendid views of the Lake District as a way of celebrating the nation's landscape well. So very, very purposely drawn comparisons between the Lake District in England, that of Italy, and certainly the mountains of the Lake District by comparison to those of the Alps or the Andes. So that sense of belonging to England becomes much more pronounced from the mid-19th century, but I think it absolutely correlates with the popularity or the fashion for the Grand Tour.
Do we have any, do we have any questions from our Zoomers?
No, not yet.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, would it be because earlier on it was the French blockaded this country, and so suddenly the Lake District, as we know it, became really popular.
Yeah.
And then because of the Grand Tour stopping, because people couldn't go on the Grand Tour, they associated it definitely with Italian lakes and that sort of thing.
Oh, very much
That's what
so.
I always thought.
Yeah.
But is that right?
Oh, no, I think very much so. So there's very that disruptive period, really, the 1790s through to 1815, certainly 1793 to 1815, is one in which access to the continent, at least other than by the Mediterranean, is severely disrupted, and does, I think, it coincides with a period, of course, of increased national self-consciousness, increased patriotism, the period also of significant civic political unrest, uncertainty, but nonetheless this idea of the war with France being something that also helps to motivate displays of patriotism, celebrations of the nation, coinciding with increased opportunities, or at least necessity of viewing one's own country, and then kind of feeling that sense of reciprocal pride as you go to view the landscape, and it instills in you love of country, love of self, love of neighbour.
Do you think that's happening now? Because of COVID, people come to the lakes, so it's back to the pride of the suddenly discovering the lakes.
Well, it's a different set of circumstances. I hazard that it be so contemporary or relevant, but no, I think there's an element of that, and maybe at its very best, when people come here, they have that opportunity to discover, whether they're English or not, when they come here to discover a part of the country, a part of the world that's new to them, a place that hopefully that they will care for.
Question just at the back.
Yeah, do you get a sense, after the 1951 designation of the Lake District National Park, whether the total number of publications increased dramatically, or whether the nomenclature was altered, or haven't you got there yet?
I haven't, it's funny, I guess partly just for heuristic reasons, it stopped in 1951. I've traced beyond 1951 a little bit. I didn't notice any huge boom in publications, but of course, in 51, there are other factors at play there in terms of austerity that tend to depress the book market. However, from what I can see, Lakeland continues to be used with increasing prevalence across the 20th century. So very interesting that these latest publications are using Lakeland in their title. So if anything, what's surprising with the introduction of Lake District National Park is it doesn't seem to blunt the rise of Lakeland as the popular prevailing term to describe the region. People will still, of course, refer to it as both the National Park, or Lake District, and Lakeland. But the creation of the National Park coincides with not necessarily an increase in the use of the term Lake District, but an increase in the use of the term Lakeland. which is kind of surprising, I suppose. But I guess the degree to which both the idea of the Lake District and of Lakeland present us the Lake District as a place, it's kind of a unit unto itself. It's either a district or it's this land that has that particular concept.
All right. There you go. Hope so.
Suggest it be called the Lakeland Park Authority.
I think it's very in sympathy with the skepticism that so we had Hodge sharing back in 1953.
Have you considered the influence of the railways and their marketing policies, as in the Great Western Railway inventing the Cornish Riviera to get people to go down their railway to Cornwall, as opposed to the south of France? They did the same to the Lake District.
Well, it's interesting though. I mean, I think definitely the railways, like with the postal service, the railways especially, they definitely increase or give people increased opportunities for geographical literacy. So they definitely, they're part of the culture producing these books. Certainly companies like the Furness Railway or even the Whitehaven Junction Railway, among others, end up producing guidebooks that accompany their line. The Lancaster Ulverston Railway down in the south does this. And so I think the railway certainly does increases mobility. It does influence the way that people experience the world, but also I guess it gives them an increased sense of geographical literacy about how places are aligned with one another. It gives people, I guess, exposure to more of the world than they previously would have had access to necessarily. I'm not sure that it had that same targeted effect as it's had in other locations, where it was about the branding of a specific location as Lakeland, specifically motivated by the railway, but they were no doubt a contributor.
A couple of questions that come to mind. One is now I suppose the publications on the lakes or Lake District or whatever you want to call it are more thematic. So you have books on climbing and walking and restaurants and food, that type of thing. I don't know whether this massive collection you come across are more general, and I wondered. My question really is about, are they all reinventing the wheel? I mean, are they all saying the same thing, all of them, or what's the difference between these books? Is there a sort of a qualitative difference? And linked to that, is there one or two key books which are the sort of reference books which everyone aspires to or tries to
They're very lucky in this respect. There's a fantastic PhD student at Lancaster named Liz Woodham, who I have the good fortune to supervise. And I mean, Liz's project, she's very interested in the history of walking guidebooks and the emergence of fell walking as an activity. I think one thing that she's looked at, of course, is how the personality of the guide as a guide changes with the passage of time. So a guide was initially someone that you would
No, I can't hear.
to guide you.
Well, I did, and then I had that difficult. No, I had to.
Whereas certainly by the later 19th century, the 20th century guide is like our Warren Clock and Company guide, and you pop in your pocket. That's another one around, why not? Books to all four corners. So the guide becomes, as it were, a physical book, and over the history of that process, lots of other changes take place. So people are more interested and able to explore the area under their own 2 feet, perhaps because of the introduction of new infrastructure, like the railway, and those changes are reflected in guidebooks. The development of climbing, mountaineering as an activity, also very evident in guidebooks published in later 19th century. The motorway age, indeed, that changes. So all these reflections do change in guidebooks, the kind of information that reflects changes in tourist or visitor behavior, visitor desires. So there's quite a lot. I mean, we began with a book like West Guide, which kind of answers your second question. What are some of the significant points along the way? West Guide in 1778 was very important. Just went on sale down in Kendal in 1778, calling itself, I guess rather ostentatiously, a guide to the lakes, which would have been an unfamiliar concept to many people to see a guidebook to this area. One hadn't previously existed, at least in such a form. So West Guide is very important, but mainly interested in the scenic beauty of the landscape. So the original title is dedicated to lovers of landscape beauty. So it's a kind of pictorial enjoyment of the landscape. And certainly by the time you come to, I guess Wordsworth begins writing that book that becomes a guide through the district of the lakes in the north of England, that title in 1835. But he begins writing it as early as 1810. It is the letterpress of a collection of etchings and engravings by a man named Joseph Wilkinson, and appears under the title of Select Views in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire, or something to that effect. And that's also very important, partly because it begins to shift the perspective from being purely pictorial to being more interested in the, I guess we would now think of as the environmental character of the landscape. So still very influenced by the view, by the sense of the fine view, or the beautiful view, or the sublime view, but also increasingly interested in the make of the environment and how that beauty might be associated with some kind of natural balance or harmoniousness. So I think those are two really interesting guidebooks because they register changing ideas and attitudes that are relevant to their period, both pictorial and environmental. And certainly by the time we get to the context of the creation of the national park, in the mid-20th century, there are books like H.H. Simmons's book, Walk in the Lake District, which is a peculiar book in its own right, should have brought a copy, partly because some of it's written in dialogue. He was a classically trained scholar and constructed these small dialogues that were between two characters, the author and the reader, to learn about their journey through the landscape. But it's very clearly written with a strong conservation agenda. Simmons was very involved as a member of the Friend of the Lake District in campaigning for the creation of the national park. And in his guidebook, he makes that very apparent the way that he's talking about the conservation of the landscape, the need to safeguard the landscape. And so again, I think a really interesting book from a later period that's reflective of the sensibilities and sensitivities of its moment. So little changes like that. Those are three really interesting, again, maybe not definitive, three really interesting guidebooks, West's, Wordsworth, and Simmons.
Do we have any more questions from here?
Yeah, you're talking about Lakeland lakes. So do I take it that the lakes came first, and then the interest in the lakes, and then the mountains?
It's interesting. I should put mountains through as well, but this always intrigued me a great deal because when looking at this landscape, I guess from a distance, you're taken by the mountains much more than the lakes. But of course, the lakes are very impressive and exquisite. But what's interesting though is certainly this comes back to Tim's point in interesting ways. Well, West's guidebook, another thing that makes it distinctive, it's very orientated around the main lakes. And really is drawing attention to them as a series of large bodies of water that you can walk around and enjoy, scenic view to scenic view, and learn something about the character of the countryside in the process. And how rather different that is than Lieutenant Hammond in the 1630s, looking out from Greystock Castle, thinking, oh golly, hideous hanging hills and great pools. So that interest in the lakes is always there, but I think it's with someone like West in the 1770s, igniting an interest for landscape beauty around the lakes. They began to be known as lakes, even more so than mountains. So the comparable interest in mountaineering doesn't develop really for almost another century. People are writing books about the ascents and passes of the Lake District. So it is very much lakes, and it's people like West that I guess help to really make that a focus for visitors to the region. Thinking back to like the Gough map ages ago now, we just have that one pool called Winandamere in the middle, and that's as extensive the description of the lakes becomes.
And the same thing happened in Scotland, because you don't hear about the Lochs district, or you hear about the Scottish Lochs, I suppose, but
and again,
it's all the same.
And again, very nationalised, the Scottish Lochs.
It could be the mountain district.
Yep.
It could have been the Highlands.
English mountains.
Surely some of the change in the books, when you go back to West in 1770, didn't people have this sort of image that the mountains were to be feared, terrible places? You didn't walk in the mountains, but you used the lakes as a means of transport. So you would expect people to know about the lakes and walk around the edge. Fast forward to 1830, you got Wordsworth Southey, probably one of the first ramblers, Lakeland, walkers in Lakeland, to then the focus changes to the footpaths and walking and what it's like sitting on the top of Scorefell watching the sun go down.
Yeah.
Whereas West's time, that would have been completely unthinkable because it would have been terrifying. So it reflects people's changing attitudes, surely. And then you fast forward another 100 years and you're at the age of Simmons and Wainwright, and the true walkers, fell walking as a hobby sport, whatever, started to become popular. So that then spawned a whole genre of walking books or climbing books. The whole thing splits up into so many areas. And surely it's all to do with changing attitudes and the way we live.
Sounds like there's a book there.
Sorry?
You've got the skeleton of a book.
I've got a few books at home, but we won't go into that.
The most common thing that overseas visitors say is when they come here, oh, I didn't realise there were mountains.
Yeah. I actually had an interesting question. I volunteer at Keswick Museum.
Okay.
And about 3 weeks ago, an American tourist walked in and asked me what a fell is.
Yeah.
Because they don't have fells in America, they have mountains. And she couldn't quite get it into her head what a fell was.
No, mirrors and forces
Yeah.
and no, but indeed, no, it's not a word that I ever would have used in that way before I moved here. It's always great to discover new names for things you thought you knew.
Where do you come from?
I'm from northwest Pennsylvania originally.
Maybe on that note, we should draw this to a close. Maybe we can all... appreciation of this sort of very erudite and fascinating discussion. I mean, it opens our eyes, I suppose, for all of us to the way in which Ullswater and this region have been appreciated over time. I will keep in mind that first slide and wonder to what extent we should make contact with our Ullswater neighbours around the world. One of the extraordinary things we discovered when we started doing Zoom is that we actually had visitors from Canada and Australia listening in to the Zoom calls. So there is a genuine international interest in what we have to do. So, thank you very much indeed. I've asked you who you would like any donations we get from this talk to go towards. Do you want to say who you'd like to?
I hope I haven't forgotten. No, I think Patterdale Mountain Rescue.
Patterdale Mountain Rescue is so they will get 50% for any proceeds that come from either online or other contributions. And maybe just one final thing about our next talk. And our next talk is from Steve Taylor, the director of the Outward Bound, who will talk here in Watermill Hall on October the 6th. At 7:30, and he will talk about the story of Halsteads and the history of the Outward Bound. So on that note, thank you to our Zoomers, thank you to the audience here, and thank you very much indeed for your. Thank you.